everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about how big lifts feed into each other, and hopefully this will make some sense for people. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And you know, I just done a video explaining, like with Alpha Destiny, for example, why his triceps stopped growing when he went on a bench specialization program, because they didn't need to grow any further because he had already built up a disproportionate amount of strength between his triceps and his chest, and then it allowed his chest to start growing once he started doing the compound movements in a way that stimulated it, because his triceps weren't going to be a weak link, and therefore they didn't need to grow any further. And so when we start thinking about compound movements, this is stuff that we have to consider. An exercise, and this is why having complementary exercises that help with what you're doing really helps, instead of just doing random stuff sometimes. Although if you have a good variety, random stuff can still work. If you just chose a few big exercises, you still get pretty big and strong. But putting a little thought into it does matter. And the thing that we have to remember is that with any given exercise, let's say it's your bench press, right? Your muscles involved in the bench press, all of them are going to get big in a way that is proportionate to the workload that they are subjected to. They're not going to get any bigger than is necessary to do the work that you're having them do, right? Whether it's the triceps, the front delts, the pecs, any of that. They're going to grow proportionate to the workload they're subjected to, right? It's pretty straightforward, guys. Muscle hypertrophy isn't that complicated. Performance and all of that becomes far more complex as far as your training programming goes than just getting a muscle bigger. Muscles grow in proportion to the workload, what they're subjected to. It's very straightforward. So this is where we start looking at complementary exercises in the sense of that when we're doing multiple exercises, sometimes this stuff can seem a little bit skewed, and sometimes there's a shift in muscle balance. But I mean, a perfect example, let's say, for example, your bench has been stalling a bit, and this is one of the problems with too much minimalism. I promote training minimalism, but I'll be the first to admit you do need some variety in your lifts. Even I wouldn't dare have someone train less than 5 or 6 big lifts per week. I just wouldn't. And so some people, that sounds crazy low, but you got to keep in mind, guys, there are people who promote minimalism even lower than what I do. There are literally people out there who say, oh, even all a powerlifter needs to get really jacked is squat, bench, deadlift, and then either some pull-ups or rows, right? There are coaches who do that, and their guys actually do have success in that regard. But the thing that you need to look at with the exercise variation is that other exercises feed into what you're doing. So for example, if your bench press has stalled, and then you go start doing a bunch of pressing, the press, which again, those unfamiliar with it, the standing barbell press is called the press, right? It's called the press. That is a historic name for it. And it starts causing your triceps, particularly even the long head gets neglected a bit on the bench press. That starts coming up, right? Your triceps start growing, your front delts grow more, your upper chest grows more. It doesn't give any real chest stimulation, but what happens? Those muscles get bigger, they get stronger as a result of you adding more workload for them off of this exercise, and then it can end up carrying back over to your bench press. In other words, there can be carryover because those muscles have gotten bigger and therefore stronger. Now, we don't get movement pattern carryover, right? We don't get movement pattern carryover, but we did make at least 2 of the primary movers larger, potentially by the extra workload. Well, what happens as a result of that? Your bench numbers will probably go up slightly. What you will then find oftentimes at that point, the pecs might become the weak link in your bench press. Not the weak link in the sense of, oh, you're not going to be able to bench, but the sense that their contribution in proportion is going to be slightly lower. Therefore, they're going to get a larger training response from the bench now. And if that happens, your pecs are going to start growing again. They're going to start growing again. And this is something that we need to look at from an interesting perspective when it comes to picking exercises. You know, a lot of times people say, well, you know, certain muscles, a smaller muscle, I need to do more direct work for it to bring up a big lift or bring up my overall physique. And hey, that works too. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, I would be the first to say if your chest is too small, for bringing up your bench, and then you know it's not proportionate. Your triceps and delts and everything are bigger. Yeah, doing some extra chest work, more pause benching, maybe some floor presses, right, from that dead stop, some extra weighted dips with a really far forward lean. There's other things you can do to help bring your chest up, and that will probably help your bench. But by that same token, people need to remember that if a muscle has become the weak link, and oftentimes the reason we develop weak links isn't because of the lifts we're doing, it's because of the other lifts we're doing, right? In other words, we're stimulating a muscle more through the exercise variations that we have, and sometimes it will start lagging behind a little bit because our training isn't always balanced. And I mean, that's a perfect example. But what people need to remember is that it will eventually catch up as long as the workload is sufficient. Meaning, if your delts and your triceps are getting too large because you're doing a lot of standing presses and your pecs are starting to lag behind, if you just shift the focus back, your chest will actually start growing again. Sorry about that, guys. Puppy's got to be tapping on the hardwood floor. You got to deal with it. But keep that in mind. We develop muscle imbalances not because of the lifts that we're doing. Look, a lift is going to stay balanced. Like if we had almost no exercise selection, in all honesty, our muscles would grow very proportionate for those exercises. It's the variation that we have sometimes that can cause the imbalances to be created. But there's our catch-22. With no exercise variation, we oftentimes don't have ways to break through plateaus. The programming becomes harder. So when exercise selection becomes too low, we tend to be more balanced in regards to what we need for that lift. And that's why I laugh at people who say, oh, you can't just squat and build a massive squat. Sure you can. You don't need a single accessory to build a massive squat. There are guys who squat 600 and 700 pounds raw who don't do any squat accessory work, zero, none. You can do it, proven. But if anything, too much accessory work is what creates the imbalances. But by that same token, that exercise variation helps build overall hypertrophy also, doesn't it? So what I would suggest to people is that think this stuff through in terms of your programming. When we're picking these different exercises that we have flow together, try to understand how they will work. And when you start to see imbalances start to develop, because invariably we all do more than one sort of press. Almost all of us do, right? I mean, I'm going to bench and I'm going to overhead press. If you get to a point to where your chest is really, really bigger and you're concerned about muscle balance, like in my case, my chest tends to grow faster than my triceps and even my delts. So I put a little more focus on my standing presses because I think that they do more for me. But if someone was in the opposite situation and their delts and their triceps are starting to exceed their chest development, go back and do more benching, do more of your weighted dips, put more workload back into those because you already have the other support muscles to build your chest, right? You just need to focus more on using them to help you build more of the weak link. Just do more bench volume than overhead press volume, and actually the extra size and strength you have from the disproportionate aspect of it when you go to the other lift will allow you to bring it up quicker. And I guess that's a different way of looking at things when we start looking at the synergy between the different lifts and exercises we do. Think of it in those terms of muscle imbalances are going to develop, and we don't necessarily always have to say, oh, I must find some other way of doing direct pec work besides my bench or my dips or whatever. It's just using it as an example. Well, no, if the other muscles are disproportionately big and strong, you can just do more work on the weighted dip or the pause bench, and your chest, for example, will start to go ahead and catch up because the other muscles involved are already there. It's the weak link in your bench. You just need to do more of that exercise. So it's a different way of thinking of accessories and assistance movements, is rather that when disproportions develop, maybe it's because you're doing too much of the other stuff instead of the main lift that you're doing, right? That can oftentimes be the problem. That can be the problem. Or again, in that case, you can just do a more chest-focused version of the main lift for a little while with a little more volume, a lot more pause benching, right? A lot more pause benching with a long pause on the chest and more total sets per week. Take some of the other form of pressing out and your chest will start catching up. Things will balance each other out because there is going to be a synergy between those different lifts. Using those other lifts can build a base where you need it in certain places that will carry back over to your weak link on another big lift. Because remember, you will always grow in proportion. If you have a muscle that is more than big enough to handle the workload of a compound movement involved, it's just going to stop growing as a result of doing more of that compound, and the weakest link is usually going to be the one that grows, right? If that's going to be the one that grows. And so that's a way to think of it in terms of muscle proportion and balancing these things out in the way different big lifts feed into each other. And you need to understand it from that perspective. And a lot of people really, really miss that because it's really a nuanced point and something that takes a lot of observation over the years to grasp. And it's not something people really always talk about. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.